the origin of the Wehrmacht. On March 16, 1935, Germany decisively broke with the limitations of the Treaty of Versailles. On that day, the small post-war army was officially transformed into the Wehrmacht, a force that integrated the Heer, the Luftwaffe, and the Kriegsmarine under the absolute command of Adolf Hitler. But that proclamation did not arise out of nowhere. For years, the regime had circumvented international prohibitions through covert projects, armored vehicles registered as agricultural machinery, military aviation disguised as civilian activities, and hidden training centers where pilots, mechanics, and officers were trained. With the return of compulsory military service, the small Reichswehr was absorbed into a much larger structure, supported by factories such as Krupp and by schools adapted to the new pace of expansion. In those same years, the Panzerwaffe was born, and the Luftwaffe took shape under Göring's direction. All of this built a modern military machine that completely surpassed earlier restrictions. But how could rearmament of such magnitude advance for so long without being stopped? From the armistice to Versailles, the imposition of total German disarmament. When the Western Front collapsed in the autumn of 1918, the military structure of the Reich lost the ability to sustain a prolonged defense. The commanders who had tried to maintain the lines witnessed the rapid loss of positions as the combined pressure of the British, French, and American forces exceeded the available strength. The lack of prepared reserves and continuous attrition prevented any real recovery. In this scenario, the political leadership received reports indicating that continuing the war would only bring further destruction with no possibility of reversing the situation. Internal communications described an exhausted army lacking operational capacity to resist new offensives and with units beginning to show signs of disintegration. As this collapse accelerated, the military apparatus attempted to remain orderly, but the events showed that the system could no longer maintain the initiative. The withdrawal in multiple sectors became a series of continuous retreats, with intermediate commanders attempting to reorganize troops that had suffered severe losses. The situation generated debates in the decision-making bodies, where it was accepted that prolonging the conflict would bring no strategic advantage. Thus, the search for an agreement to halt the fighting was promoted, and government representatives formally requested an armistice. When the ceasefire of November 11th was signed, the army received precise instructions on the procedures for leaving advanced positions, handing over designated material, and concentrating in points previously indicated by the Allies. The document regulated every movement, from the evacuation of territories to the complete withdrawal to agreed zones within Germany. These provisions were presented as transitional measures while a final treaty was being prepared to establish new military obligations. In those months, German authorities faced external pressure and internal instability marked by protests, administrative changes, and the fall of the old imperial government. During the winter of 1918 and the first months of 1919, the country experienced profound political restructuring. A new system of government was established after the abdication of the monarch, and institutions emerged that attempted to regain control amid strikes, armed clashes, and various uprisings. Civil leaders had to deal with this situation while awaiting the conditions of the treaty that would define the military framework of the new state. International meetings progressed slowly, but from the beginning it was evident that the victorious powers intended to reduce the German military apparatus to a minimum. The German delegation received only partial information, while the Allies finalized the specific points concerning army size, authorized organization, and the complete list of permitted armaments. By mid-1919, the conference meeting in Paris presented the German representatives with the final text of the future agreement. The pages devoted to military matters were contained in Articles 159 to 213. There it was established that the land forces had to be limited to a fixed contingent of 100,000 troops. It was also determined that only 7 infantry divisions and 3 cavalry divisions could exist, all subject to highly restricted command. The document prohibited any structure resembling a general staff and ordered the dissolution of the bodies that had coordinated military planning during the war. Similarly, it required the elimination of armored vehicles, heavy artillery, long-range guns, and weapons capable of striking at great distances. The restrictions included the total renunciation of a military air force. It was stated that the country could not retain combat squadrons, reconnaissance aircraft, bombers, or any type of aircraft intended for military functions. Along with this prohibition came the requirement to hand over or destroy remaining aviation equipment and to cease all future production of aircraft for military use. In the same spirit, the construction, possession or use of submarines was banned, whether for offensive or defensive missions, and the immediate handover of those still in German territory after the armistice was ordered. The treaty specified that chemical weapons and the facilities related to their production had to be eliminated under international supervision. The manufacture of munitions and war materials was limited to previously authorized plants, whose activity could be inspected at any time by Allied bodies. To ensure compliance, an inter-Allied commission was created to inspect depots, factories and barracks. Its members could require documents, review inventories, monitor troop movements and verify adherence to every provision. Visits were announced with little notice, and German authorities were obliged to provide full access to all facilities connected to the former military apparatus. While these regulations were being imposed, the demobilization process advanced within the country. Commanders had to release large numbers of personnel, reorganize the surviving units, and reduce them to the established limit. Orders sent to military districts detailed how each phase was to be carried out, from the suspension of recruitment to the transfer of material to the locations indicated by the International Commission. The former Army Corps were dissolved and replaced by much smaller structures, and training centers were subjected to new rules that severely restricted the number of active officers. In several regions, the orderly withdrawal combined with local tensions. The lack of resources and political uncertainty caused unrest in cities where soldiers returned without a clear system for reintegration. Regional governments attempted to maintain discipline, but shortages of supplies and pressure from armed groups made that goal difficult. All of this occurred while German delegates in Paris unsuccessfully sought to soften certain articles, as the victorious powers insisted on maintaining every point without substantial modification. When it was announced that the treaty had to be accepted without changes, the new German government assessed the risks of resuming the fighting against an overwhelmingly superior enemy. Military reports indicated that the country lacked the capability to resist a joint offensive, and the economic situation made it impossible to sustain a prolonged conflict. Eventually, the authorities approved the signing, and the text came into force, requiring the immediate implementation of the military limits. The reception records described the systematic handover of the required material and the Allied verification in arsenals and factories. Within military circles, the reduction to 100,000 members generated tensions and debates. Many officers left the service due to a lack of available positions, while others attempted to remain within the new structure. Discussions among the command focused on how to reorganize a reduced force that had to conform to the imposed guidelines. These internal meetings, recorded in reports delivered to the civilian government, showed continual concern about preserving at least a professional corps capable of guaranteeing minimal continuity. However, the strict application of the regulations limited any effort to expand capabilities or maintain previous structures. In the months following the signing, the International Commission intensified its inspection rounds. Its representatives visited weapons depots, railway workshops, transport facilities, and former barracks. They also reviewed documents from units still in the process of dissolution. Oversight was constant and detailed as the Allies sought to ensure that no undeclared weapons or equipment remained. German military officials had to submit regular reports and respond to specific questions about material and personnel movements. Political tensions within the country continued during the implementation of these obligations. Groups from various currents expressed rejection of the signed terms, and the government faced protests questioning the legitimacy of the agreement. Nevertheless, the authorities maintained their commitment to compliance to avoid additional reprisals or sanctions. The situation in the streets was complex, but those responsible for military administration continued working within the imposed limitations to prevent further deterioration. During this period, the new military structures had largely adjusted to the terms of the document. The number of personnel had been reduced as required, and the weapons inventory reflected minimal capacity. Former servicemen who were unable to remain in the military sought other paths in a society marked by unemployment and uncertainty. Military leaders continued sending reports to Berlin describing difficulties adapting to such a restrictive framework while insisting on maintaining a small core of officers experienced in planning and command. International directives remained firm and inspections continued in the following years. The country was subjected to a system of monitoring and control that restricted any attempt to regain the military capacity it had possessed before the Great Conflict. With the treaty in force, the former Imperial Army gave way to a reduced force monitored by powers determined to prevent the reconstruction of a strong military apparatus. In this environment, German military life became conditioned by a set of rules that marked the beginning of a completely different era. The Reichswehr, the reduced structure that concealed a larger project. At the end of 1919, when most of the reduction imposed by the victorious powers had already been carried out and the German army was beginning to match the maximum authorized number, attention shifted to the task of transforming that small contingent into a stable, professional force, fully integrated into the institutional framework of the Republic. It was then that the stage began in which the Reichswehr took its definitive form with a clear central command, an orderly administration, and a small group of officers selected under very strict criteria. That selection would determine the army's internal culture throughout the following decade. The government then defined a structure that had to conform to the permitted size, although it sought to preserve high levels of quality in all positions. The President of the Republic remained at the top of the chain of command, while the Reichswehr minister assumed the daily management of the institution. Under that authority, the Heeresleitung, the office directing the army, and the Marineleitung, in charge of the small naval force still in existence, were organized. From this scheme, the Reichswehr began to function as a unified body with clearly delimited branches subordinate to civilian power. The reorganization was based on maintaining only those units indispensable for operating within the permitted personnel limit. The infantry and cavalry divisions were distributed into military regions that coincided with the former Army Corps, which made it possible to take advantage of already familiar infrastructures. Each of these regions was headed by a commander responsible for training, discipline, and local administration. Although the number of troops was far smaller than in the past, every area was provided with personnel capable of fulfilling essential functions and sustaining a basic level of instruction. The small size of the institution forced the design of a strict selection process. Candidates had to have a clean record, know modern procedures, and demonstrate the ability to assume long-term responsibilities, since service was established in long periods to avoid constant rotation. The aim was to create a force made up of soldiers who would remain long enough to acquire solid experience and transmit it to new recruits. Continuity thus became a central element of the Reichswehr's identity. With the staff already defined, the military administration was divided among several specialized offices. One of the most important was the Truppenamt, which acted as a coordination center for organizational, training, and operational matters. Although the treaty prohibited maintaining the former general staff, this department assumed many of its tasks through discrete work that did not violate formal limits. The Truppenamt drafted regulations, adjusted procedures, and supervised training, which gave it decisive influence within the overall structure. Another fundamental body was the Waffenamt, responsible for managing the permitted war material. Its mission was to control reserves, organize acquisitions, and establish standards for the maintenance of available equipment. Weapons inspections and unit inspections completed this work through periodic reviews that verified that everything functioned within authorized margins. These areas, together with inspections divided by specialties, allowed the Army to maintain a complex administration despite its reduced size. The ministry also established mechanisms to ensure internal discipline, especially at a time when political tensions were still present throughout the country. Soldiers' requests and complaints had to go directly through the Reichswehr minister, who had the authority to act on individual cases when considered necessary. This supervisory channel sought to avoid situations like those experienced in the months following the end of the war, when entire units had made decisions without central control. The new system aimed to ensure that every member of the army responded to legal institutions and not to external political ties. This period coincided with strong conflicts within the Republic, and the Reichswehr was repeatedly forced to intervene to preserve order. Although the force had a limited mandate, many regional authorities depended on it to contain disturbances and violent clashes. These interventions increased the visibility of the army and reinforced its role as an instrument of the government, although they generated tensions with sectors that questioned the use of the military to resolve internal problems. Even so, the country's stability depended largely on this constant intervention. At the beginning of 1923, the political and economic situation further deteriorated with the Ruhr crisis and hyperinflation. The Reichswehr had to take on additional tasks related to protecting facilities, transporting supplies, and monitoring areas where an uprising was feared. But this critical period allowed the commanders to insist on the need to separate, once and for all, military functions from internal security duties. Once the most severe tensions had been contained, the army's leadership declared at the end of that year that it was time to concentrate exclusively on military matters and minimize interventions in political or social conflicts. This decision had direct consequences for the training of officers and non-commissioned officers. Instruction had to focus on maintaining the professionalism of the ranks without allowing units to be drawn into the country's internal disputes. The military education system was adjusted according to these new priorities. The schools had to prepare future commanders to lead small units capable of carrying out specific functions within strict limits. The goal was to preserve a level of efficiency that would allow reaction to possible crises without needing to expand troop numbers. External restrictions also affected the availability of training centers. Many academies closed by mandate of the victorious powers, so training had to be concentrated in fewer facilities with programs adapted to the new conditions. In this context, the experience accumulated by instructors became more important than ever, as they had to compensate for the lack of schools with daily training in units distributed throughout the country. The continuity of military education depended on internal discipline and on the commander's ability to sustain a constant routine. The limited room for maneuver led the institution to develop methods that allowed it to preserve technical and administrative knowledge without violating any of the imposed clauses. The centralization of archives, reports, and regulations ensured that each modification or adjustment was recorded and could be used for training purposes. This internal flow of documentation helped maintain coherence among the Army's various branches and prevented the scarcity of personnel from generating differences in criteria between regions. Each of these measures helped turn the Reichswehr into a cohesive professional body capable of operating within strict limits without losing effectiveness. The reduced structure required precise administration, rigorous personnel selection, and detailed supervision of every area. From the end of 1919 to 1924, the Army was built on these foundations, consolidating an institutional identity centered on discipline, continuity, and adaptation to a legal framework that conditioned every aspect of its existence. Hans von Seeckt and the design of the modern army. From the early post-war years, Hans von Seeckt took command of the German army with the idea of completely reviewing recent military experience. He assumed the responsibility of leading a reduced institution that had to adapt to a strict framework, and he did so by establishing a dynamic of constant study. He gathered groups of officers to examine official reports, command communiques, and materials drawn from the previous conflict. He ordered the compilation of campaign assessments and reports from the former frontline corps to find patterns that explained the failures of 1914 to 1918. Under his coordination, these teams worked with documents from the High Command of the Imperial period and with statistical analyses on the evolution of weaponry during the war years. As these tasks progressed, Seeckt promoted a training system that sought to surpass the old organization. He redefined exercises, adjusted internal manuals, and set new rules for daily instruction. He introduced guidelines on relations between commanders and subordinates, emphasizing that each level of the chain of command should know how to solve situations without waiting for direct orders from higher levels. Alongside this, he had units adopt training routines that combined rapid movements, immediate reorganization after maneuvers, and continuous review of coordination between sections. With this approach, Seeckt intended for every component of the army to have the ability to act with initiative. He encouraged young officers to understand the importance of handling changing information without losing internal cohesion. He explained that the ability to make decisions under pressure had to become a habitual feature within the structure. These ideas spread through military schools, summer meetings for commanders, and courses given in different regions of the country, where the need to improve individual judgment without weakening collective discipline was stressed. In parallel to these changes, SIGT supervised the organization of personnel to form a concentrated professional base. He reduced the margins for automatic promotion and demanded constant evaluations to retain only those who demonstrated technical skill and leadership ability. At the same time, he established selection criteria based on wartime experience and performance shown in the new training programs. Thanks to this system, the Army maintained a homogeneous core of officers capable of transmitting directives without deviations. SIGT's reforms also extended to the level of internal organization. He readjusted the functions of divisions and regiments so that each unit could adapt to various scenarios. He defined structures that facilitated the rapid mobilization of personnel and resources if necessary, even with the limited number of troops allowed by international regulations. To achieve this, he designed administrative arrangements that made it easier to control the flow of information from the higher commands down to the companies. Within these changes, SIGT encouraged the systematic study of recent operations, both domestic and foreign. He requested reports on foreign maneuvers and reviews of technical documents produced abroad. These analyses included observations on combined movements, the use of communications, and the effects of different types of weaponry on maneuvers. The results were integrated into training programs and discussed in periodic meetings held at training centers. As the decade progressed, SIGT maintained the objective of preserving professional cohesion through demanding discipline. He emphasized practices that prevented passive routines and reinforced surprise inspections to monitor the level of preparedness. These reviews checked the condition of basic weaponry, the organization of warehouses, and mastery of training regulations. The observations were sent to his office, where results were compared between units to detect recurring weaknesses. In this context, the Army sought discrete methods to maintain technical competencies that were officially prohibited. This process did not involve developing full capabilities, but rather preserving fundamental knowledge within the legal framework. To do so, SIGT allowed certain groups to work with devices and tools that, without violating regulations, helped sustain skills related to more advanced functions. These groups operated in supervised facilities, where maintenance tests and procedural evaluations were carried out. The Army's leadership also promoted academic relations with the country's technical centers. They established contacts with specialized institutes and engineering schools that could provide studies on materials, basic design, and processes that improved the functioning of permitted equipment. These connections enabled technically trained officers to keep a reasonable level of up-to-date knowledge without compromising external obligations. From the analyses collected in the early years, SIGT established guidelines on how the Army should react to complex situations. In his internal meetings, he stated that each officer had to be capable of reorganizing his forces if the situation changed. This approach reinforced the idea of flexible command that he highlighted in his reports. Each document produced in his circle showed the intention that the Army regain its capacity for initiative without depending exclusively on the highest echelon. As he incorporated these practices, SIGT maintained discussions with different departments to define how the Army could make use of available resources within the country. These negotiations included administrative aspects, allocation of technical functions, and reorganization of offices in charge of material. His priority was to maintain a group of specialists distributed in a balanced way to prevent technical knowledge from being concentrated in a single place. The study of the previous war continued throughout the decade. The analysis groups produced reports that compiled experiences gained in operations of 1914, 1915, and later campaigns. These documents were classified by topics such as infantry employment, coordination with permitted artillery, and operational movements under pressure. They also reviewed cases in which line breakages or loss of cohesion occurred to identify errors that could be corrected in the future. In the international sphere, SIGT cautiously analyzed the possibility of establishing technical perspectives with other countries. It was in this context that discrete links were established that allowed information to be exchanged in very specific areas. According to the data documented in Faustian Bargain, in these years limited agreements were made that facilitated access to spaces where technical tests could be carried out. The activities took place in facilities located outside national territory, which made it possible to work with equipment that officially could not be handled within the country. The officers sent to these facilities participated in exercises in which the effects of different types of weaponry were observed and data on mechanical functioning were collected. These programs were part of a cooperative framework that included the study of vehicles and devices intended to improve mobility, something that could not be developed on home soil due to the prevailing restrictions. Moreover, these exchanges made it possible to evaluate working methods applied in the armed forces of the host region. The conclusions of the international activities were sent to the Army's technical departments to be integrated with their own studies. This reinforced SECT's intention to keep military knowledge up to date without compromising formal legality. The reports included observations on maneuvers, detected failures in the tested mechanisms, and possible improvements in the functioning of specialized units. Over time, the accumulated analyses and implemented reforms consolidated a disciplined structure that had managed to sustain its professional level despite external conditions. SECT's decisions during the 1920s shaped how the commands were organized, how personnel were trained, and what methods were used to study wartime experiences. These aspects were essential for shaping an army that sought to maintain its operational capacity without violating the obligations imposed after the world conflict. The day everything changed, Hitler and the army face their first power struggle. When 1933 began, the German army was still operating within the limited framework inherited from the post-war period, although it maintained a disciplined internal structure. On the 30th of January, the arrival of Adolf Hitler as head of government opened an entirely new scenario for the military institution. From the first day, the new leader sought to present himself to the command as someone willing to improve the position of the armed apparatus within the state. In the weeks that followed, government representatives reorganized ministries, removed administrative obstacles, and changed the composition of the bodies responsible for overseeing military affairs. Immediately, the Minister of Defense, Werner von Blomberg, gained an authority he had not held during the Weimar Republic, and he did so with the explicit support of the new head of the executive. A key moment was the meeting of 3 February 1933, when Hitler outlined before the senior command his intention to strengthen the military apparatus as long as the army leadership cooperated with his political project. In that meeting, the officers heard promises of institutional support and saw that the government was willing to remove obstacles imposed during previous years. This gesture generated a favorable disposition within the military leadership, which was tired of internal restrictions and political tensions accumulated over the previous decade. Blomberg, taking advantage of this climate, increased his presence in the cabinet and succeeded in consolidating the weight of the Ministry of Defense within the new regime. The reorganization process during the first months affected both civilian and military structures. The authorities adopted symbolic measures that directly connected the army with the emblems of the new government. The use of the regime's colors and official music was authorized in public events, and administrative changes were introduced that facilitated communication between the ministry and the head of state. At the same time, the institution was given room to focus on its military functions without interference from other bodies in the country. Within the units, internal rules were adopted that reflected the new political orientation. As this rapprochement between the government and the army took place, the presence of the SA increased rapidly. This organization, led by Ernst Röhm, had gathered an enormous number of members during 1933 and assumed functions that generated tensions with the professional institution. The SA incorporated under its control other paramilitary associations, including the Stahlhelm, which reinforced its influence. The continuous growth of this body worried the military leadership, who observed how Röhm sought a role that could conflict with the formal monopoly of the use of arms. The Reichswehr depended partially on the SA for certain training activities, which increased the sense of vulnerability within the institution. In this context, Blomberg tried to maintain a balance between his alliance with the government and the defense of the army's position in relation to the SA. Although the regime used the SA to reinforce its internal power, The military leadership saw that its colossal size made the organization a competitor in the military realm. Röhm spoke insistently of his aspirations and did not hide his intention to reshape the armed system to his own benefit. These statements created unease among the officers who feared that any reform driven by Röhm would directly affect the professional structure of the military institution. The climate of tension between the SA and the army persisted throughout 1933 and worsened as Röhm strengthened his position. The leadership of the Reichswehr observed how the paramilitary leader sought to influence the formation of security policies and the internal distribution of power. The risk for the army was evident. If the SA succeeded in becoming the dominant force within the state, the professional institution would be subordinated or even displaced. This possibility made the officers closely follow the political developments and maintain the need to secure a direct link with Hitler. In the first half of 1934, the relationship between Hitler, Röhm, and the military leadership reached a critical point. The officers reported periodically to Blomberg on the internal movements of the SA and the insistence of its leader in claiming authority. These reports fed the idea that the Reichswehr needed a solution that would eliminate the internal danger. The situation became unsustainable when the High Command confirmed that the rivalry with the SA could lead to open confrontation. In those months, the reports indicated a constant deterioration in the relationship between Röhm and state officials responsible for coordinating security matters. The regime's response arrived on the 30th of June, 1934. That day, Hitler undertook a series of arrests and executions directed against the SA leadership and other figures considered a threat to the government. In this operation, Generals Kurt von Schleicher and Ferdinand von Bredow were also killed. However, the army leadership did not react against the purge. For the institution, the gesture of the head of government meant the elimination of the rival that had questioned its very existence. With the disappearance of Röhm and the SA leadership, the army regained without obstacles its status as the state's exclusive armed force. The purge had immediate effects. On 13 July 1934, Hitler publicly declared that only the military institution recognized by the state was authorized to bear arms. This decision formally marked the supremacy of the professional structure over any party organization. The officers interpreted this announcement as confirmation that the government would support the continuity of a disciplined army far removed from paramilitary ambitions. Furthermore, it reinforced the idea that the relationship with the head of the executive had entered a new phase in which the army enjoyed a secure position. After the elimination of its main internal adversary, the institution openly supported the government. Blomberg praised the head of the executive for having prevented a possible internal war and emphasized that the country's stability depended on the joint work between civilian authorities and military leadership. The minister's declaration consolidated the alliance between the army and the regime, while the SA lost all relevance in military affairs. The purge made clear that control of force would henceforth rest with the professional structure, which increased the army's margin of action in the following months. By late 1934, the process of politicization within the armed forces had already begun. The leadership introduced ideological training courses that sought to adapt personnel to the new official language. Units incorporated ceremonies and symbols associated with the regime, and racial requirements were applied that reflected the priorities of the state. These measures showed how the army gradually integrated into the dominant political structure without losing its professional character. The institutional change was not limited to symbols. The regime removed legal barriers and diplomatic restrictions that had limited military activity during the previous republic. The institution regained freedom to reorganize offices, revise internal programs, and adjust its administration. The elimination of the SA allowed the leadership to focus on its own decisions without the pressure of a parallel organization. With this, the army strengthened its authority and reduced the risk of external interference. During this period, relations between the army and the government became closer. The leadership observed that the head of the executive increasingly relied on the military structure to consolidate internal order. The elimination of rivals ensured that no organization could compete for control of security. At the same time, the armed institution adopted a favorable stance toward the regime due to the advantages obtained. By the end of 1934, the collaboration between the two parties was firmly established. The army had overcome the threat of a paramilitary organization that sought to impose itself within its sphere, and the government had succeeded in securing its political dominance with the support of the leadership. The relationship born in those 2 years marked a profound change in the country's military history and prepared the ground for future decisions that would transform the structure of the armed forces in the years to come. Wehrmacht, the legal birth of a renewed force. During the first months of 1935, the government made decisions that completely modified the legal situation of the armed forces. Until that moment, the institution was still limited by the provisions accepted after the war, although in recent years the regime had removed administrative obstacles and created a favorable climate for reorganizing internal structures. In March, the authorities announced that the country was definitively abandoning the military restrictions established in the treaty signed in 1919. This announcement had a public dimension not seen before, because for the first time, the leadership declared openly that the state considered the stage of international limitations finished. The decision meant that the army regained freedom to expand its size, revise its organization, and plan growth that had previously been prohibited. The announcement generated an immediate reaction in diplomatic bodies of other countries, but within the territory, it marked the transition from a restricted framework to a scenario of open expansion. The Ministry of Defense began drafting new regulations to adapt the institution to its expanded role. Official documents indicated that the objective was to create an armed force of greater scope and with a modern structure. These measures were written in decrees published throughout the year and disseminated through instructions sent to units of all levels. One of the central changes was the formal introduction of compulsory military service. The government presented it as a necessary procedure to sustain a large armed apparatus. This step was adopted through a law that established the duration of the training period, the age of incorporation, and the selection mechanisms. The measure completely modified the internal system, as the institution had functioned for years with a limited number of personnel. Now it had to integrate a constant flow of conscripts arriving from different regions. For this, training centers were reorganized, facilities expanded, and training programs adapted to the new volume of personnel were established. The decree reintroducing this service also assigned specific responsibilities to the Ministry of Defense to ensure that each contingent received uniform training. District commanders assumed supervision tasks to coordinate the arrival of conscripts and ensure that deadlines were met. The arrival of thousands of young men in the barracks required the creation of new logistical and administrative layers, which in turn encouraged the expansion of bodies responsible for supplies, infrastructure, and personnel. The increase in personnel transformed the internal life of the army, which ceased to be a reduced institution and became an organization with massive presence throughout the country. In that same year, those responsible for military affairs announced that the traditional designation was being replaced with a new name. The army would no longer be known as the Reichswehr and would adopt the designation Wehrmacht. This modification was not only symbolic, it reflected the intention to build a unified armed apparatus with far greater capacity than the previous structure. The new designation appeared in official documents, administrative reports, and internal communications sent to units and local offices. The change was incorporated into ministerial records and regulations distributed among different levels of command. The transition from a limited army to an expanded force required revising the number of divisions, territorial distribution, and functions assigned to each branch. The ministry established new regional commands to manage the increase in personnel, and the staffs of existing units were reorganized. Commands received instructions to prepare the officer corps in charge of leading groups of conscripts and coordinating training phases. Throughout the year, manuals and procedural rules were drafted detailing the structure of the new bodies and the way they were to be integrated into the expanded system. The increase in personnel required revising the schedule of exercises and maneuvers. Activities were planned that would allow the integration of the new contingents and their performance in different terrains to be verified. For this, larger training areas were assigned, and resources were distributed that facilitated the mobilization of newly formed units. In addition, training plans were updated to include practices aimed at improving coordination between newly incorporated groups and veteran units. These exercises were carried out under the supervision of senior commanders who evaluated the institution's ability to adapt to the pace of growth. In the administrative sphere, the Ministry of Defense issued communications directed to national offices to adjust personnel management. The instructions detailed how to register the new conscripts, organize their placement, and keep the status of each contingent updated. Departments were created to control the flow of personnel, analyze regional distribution, and detect specific equipment needs. The mass incorporation of young men also required the expansion of medical, administrative, and logistical services supporting each unit. During this process, the government promoted periodic meetings between military and civilian representatives to coordinate the implementation of the new regulations. In these meetings, subjects such as the availability of facilities, allocation of resources, and the pace of implementation of compulsory service were discussed. The transition had to be carried out in an orderly manner, and official documents stressed the need to maintain a clear and coherent structure. The authorities wanted to ensure that each region could absorb the increase in personnel without creating organizational problems. With the legal expansion of the armed forces, the country sent a clear signal abroad about its intention to regain a more prominent military role. In official speeches, state representatives explained that these measures were intended to guarantee security and stability. Foreign powers reacted with concern, but within the territory the process advanced without interruption. The military institution interpreted these changes as the definitive confirmation that the stage of restrictions had ended and that a new phase had begun in which it could act with greater independence. Internally, the change of designation and compulsory service transformed the distribution of personnel. The number of officers increased to fill new command positions, and those already in the institution received additional responsibilities. Training centers adapted their programs to the new demands, and systems were established to evaluate the conscripts' performance during the training period. Once the initial instruction was completed, the young men were assigned to operational units where they continued their preparation under direct supervision. The open expansion of the army also required coordinating tasks related to warehouses, supplies, and transport. Large quantities of basic equipment had to be mobilized to clothe, house, and train the new contingents. In addition, it was necessary to reorganize the maintenance of facilities and adapt infrastructures to accommodate thousands of conscripts. These activities increased the size of offices responsible for internal support, and the ministry issued specific directives to ensure that resources were used efficiently. Throughout the year, the High Command reported to the government on the state of implementation of compulsory service and structural expansion. The reports highlighted progress in the pace of incorporation, the fulfillment of objectives, and the gradual integration of conscripts into the units. Necessary adjustments were also recorded in areas where personnel growth exceeded the initial capacity of the barracks. Civil and military authorities sought immediate solutions to these situations, such as expanding temporary facilities or redistributing contingents between nearby regions. The implementation of the expansion program culminated in the consolidation of a renewed armed force. By the end of 1935, the institution had become a structured apparatus with a number of personnel far higher than the previous year. The presence of the designation Wehrmacht in internal documents and official communications reflected the end of a stage marked by international limitations and the beginning of a phase in which the armed apparatus regained a central role within the state. The constant supervision of the government ensured that the process advanced rapidly, and the military institution assumed the new organizational scale as a fundamental part of its functioning. The oath to the Führer, when loyalty ceased to belong to the state. In mid-1934, the authorities decided to modify one of the formal foundations that had defined the relationship between the military institution and the state. Until that year, soldiers were required to pronounce a commitment directed toward the Constitution and the official institutions. That text had been inherited from the previous period and stated that loyalty in uniform had to remain with the established legal order. In August 1934, this formula disappeared completely. From that moment on, the obligation was no longer directed toward the state structure, but toward an individual figure. The death of President Paul von Hindenburg allowed the government to reorganize the country's highest functions. In that context, the political leadership announced that the military would have to pronounce a completely new formula. The text presented established that each member of the army had to commit directly to Adolf Hitler. The directive was communicated through official decrees indicating that the previous commitment was abolished and that the new version entered into force immediately. This change transformed the nature of the bond between the institution and the government, since the oath shifted from a commitment to constitutional authority to an obligation to a person who concentrated power. Sources describe that this new formula had clear and precise content. The document required soldiers and officers to obey Hitler unconditionally and to support his decisions. The text placed the head of government at the center of the structure of loyalties, turning the act of swearing into a direct commitment that did not include mentions of the state, the law, or higher institutions. This rewriting of the commitment represented a departure from the professional tradition that had characterized the army, because the institution had historically maintained a sense of belonging linked to formal structures rather than to an isolated figure. The directive was disseminated in barracks across the country through orders explaining the new obligation. Commanders received instructions to organize ceremonies in which all members had to pronounce the formula. Internal documents recorded the need to enforce the procedure in all units without exceptions. The orders also clarified that the oath had to be spoken publicly and formally, reinforcing the idea that the new bond had an immediate practical effect within military life. Accounts indicate that in many places simultaneous events were organized to ensure that the order was fulfilled within the same period. Wetter describes that the measure generated profound effects on the army's internal culture. The obligation to answer to a person changed the meaning of individual responsibility because duty was no longer articulated through an institutional framework with previous controls and norms. Now, obedience was directed toward a leader who concentrated political and military authority. This shift had practical consequences for the way commanders understood their functions, because the hierarchical structure became linked to the personal power of the leader. The oath made any instruction issued from the top acquire a moral and disciplinary weight different from what it had held in previous periods. The process also affected officers who had developed their careers in the Weimar Republic. Many of them were accustomed to a model of loyalty resting on formal institutions. When the reference to the state was replaced by a promise to Hitler, the professional culture began to orient itself toward the direct following of the head of government's decisions. Wetter highlights that this change reduced the distance between political power and the military structure, because the new formula placed the institution under explicit subordination without the need for additional legal mechanisms. Thus, the oath reinforced Hitler's personal authority within the armed forces. Inside the barracks, the measure produced varied reactions. Some commanders interpreted the change as a natural expression of the new political system, while others observed that the act had implications altering traditional principles of the army. However, sources agree that the formula was accepted and applied without organized resistance. Internal discipline and hierarchical structure made it easier for the process to be carried out quickly. Orders arrived from higher levels, and officers in each unit ensured that the ceremony was conducted as established. Reports sent to the ministry recorded that the procedure had been completed in all regions. The new text also generated consequences in the relationship between superiors and subordinates. The obligation to obey Hitler unconditionally influenced the way officers transmitted orders. The chain of command functioned as a channel ensuring that each instruction received from above had direct backing in the oath spoken. This situation reduced the spaces for personal interpretation that had existed in earlier periods. As Wetter explains, the formula turned the leader's will into a reference point placed above any institutional consideration. Sources also indicate that the measure had a social component extending beyond internal discipline. By committing to obey Hitler, soldiers became part of a system in which political leadership and the military institution were explicitly linked. This union affected the public perception of the army because the institution appeared aligned with the figure who governed the country. In this way, the oath integrated the military into the political framework of the regime not only operationally but symbolically as well. The reaction within the officer corps shows that the change was assumed as an official obligation that had to be fulfilled without questioning. Documents cited by Wetter indicate that some commanders interpreted the new formula as a guarantee of stability, believing that the leader had the authority to maintain order within the country. For others, the measure meant that the army became tied to decisions that no longer passed through customary mechanisms. This diversity of perceptions did not generate conflict because internal discipline required fulfilling the order without expressing disagreement. In practical terms, the personal oath had a direct effect on the institution's mental structure. The idea of absolute obedience toward Hitler reinforced a culture in which the leader's will could not be questioned from within. Wetter shows that this situation was decisive in understanding how officers responded to later political decisions, because the commitment pronounced in 1934 created a framework of duty that shaped the institution's behavior in critical situations. Loyalty to the leader became a central element of military identity, displacing the former relationship based on constitutional norms. The measure also affected how rank-and-file soldiers understood their function. The oath reminded them that their duty was directly linked to the leader. Many units held sessions to explain the meaning of the new formula, and commanders emphasized that any action had to conform to that obligation. Although the process did not generate open resistance, it did transform the internal atmosphere. The constant presence of Hitler's name in the act of commitment reinforced the central place the leader's figure held within the system. By the end of 1934, the process was fully implemented. Ministerial reports indicated that all units had held the ceremony and that the new formula had become part of standard procedures. The institution had left behind the model of commitment to the state and now responded directly to an authority concentrating both political and military functions. Wetter stresses that this step had profound effects in the following years because the army became subordinated to the decisions of a leader who faced no institutional limits. Everything began with this formal modification, an act that changed the conceptual framework of obedience within the institution and defined the relationship between the army and power for the rest of the decade. The Centralized Command, the day the OKW was born. When the new defense law was implemented in May 1935, the German military system became subordinated directly to the figure of the head of state. That regulation granted Adolf Hitler the post of Oberster Befehlshaber, which made his authority the final instance in matters of the armed forces. From that moment, any strategic or administrative decision had to flow to him, and the old inherited structure was forced to operate with that hierarchy as its basis. In the following months, that formal change provoked adjustments within each branch, which had to adapt to a leadership where the central figure left less room for intermediary bodies. Within the army, the Oberkommando des Heeres, OKH, initially retained the weight it had held since the Reichswehr era, but that influence began to coexist with internal tensions. Here, leadership tried to preserve its traditional role as the professional corps, while other offices linked to the former military administration sought to expand their participation in directing the force. Among them was the Wehrmacht, a body that managed matters common to the services and that aimed to become a real coordination tool. That coexistence generated constant rivalries, especially when questions arose about who should control preparation for a future conflict. Here commanders, led by General Werner von Fritsch, watched how the previous balance was being altered. Beside them, figures like General Beck believed the army should retain the capacity to plan and conduct operations without external intervention. At the same time, Wilhelm Keitel and Alfred Jodl acted within the Wehrmacht, seeing an opportunity to balance the OKH through a structure that would shape joint leadership. Those clashes, although still contained, showed that the system inherited from the previous phase was beginning to be overtaken by the ongoing political reorganization. During 1936 and 1937, that struggle was expressed in a series of memoranda, reorganization proposals, and internal discussions affecting the relationship between the branches of the armed forces. The Heer defended its traditional primacy in decision-making, while the Wehrmacht raised the need for a closer point of contact with the head of state. The Navy, under Admiral Erich Raeder and the Air Force leadership, which already operated with its own autonomy, also showed reservations about any modification that could reduce their competencies. Each group tried to preserve spheres of authority, but the final word belonged to Hitler, who evaluated those tensions according to the regime's convenience. In that context, the political leadership increasingly reinforced direct intervention in the military structure. Continuous contact between Hitler and Keitel made the Wehrmachtamt increasingly dependent on the head of state, which altered the balance that had existed between the branches. Although a unified central body did not yet exist, internal movements anticipated a larger transformation. Future leadership would cease to be the exclusive competence of the Heer, which saw its historical authority begin to diminish. At the beginning of 1938, an event accelerated the change. The resignation of the War Minister Werner von Blomberg and the almost simultaneous dismissal of the Army Commander Fritsch left the General Staff without heavyweight references. That double fall allowed Hitler to reorganize the entire military structure without the usual resistance. The removal of the two posts opened a space that until then had not been available. With that void at the head of the military apparatus, Hitler proceeded to abolish the War Ministry, an institution that had for years served as a mediator between the armed forces and the state. The decree formalizing the new organization was issued on the 4th of February 1938. That document established that the head of state would personally assume total direction of the armed forces without ministerial intermediaries. To sustain that new structure, the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, OKW, was created as an office responsible for managing the central matters of the entire military. The body absorbed the functions previously performed by the dissolved ministry and assumed responsibility for transmitting Hitler's orders to each branch. From that moment, any strategic decision had to be channeled through the OKW. The leadership of the new office was entrusted to Wilhelm Keitel, who came to occupy a post equivalent to a general coordinator of the armed forces. Under his direction, a working group was organized that would soon become the operational core of the system, the Führungsstab, led by Jodl. That body was responsible for preparing assessments, drafting reports for the head of state and maintaining the link with each branch when issues affecting the whole arose. Keitel's position ensured that decisions flowed directly from the political leadership to the military commands without formal obstacles. With the creation of the OKW, the relationship between the branches changed completely. The Heer continued to possess its own high command, but it was subordinated to an office that answered immediately to Hitler. The Navy and the Air Force maintained their internal structures, although they had to coordinate with the OKW for any matter involving the entirety of the armed forces. That subordination, defined through subsequent decrees, placed the political leader above the professional framework that had characterized the Reichswehr and the early phase of the Heer in previous years. In April 1938, Keitel presented a memorandum detailing how the new organization should function. That document explained how the OKW would serve as a center of general coordination and how responsibilities would be distributed among the various offices. Hitler approved that plan, which consolidated the OKW's position as the instance that centralized the flow of information and orders. With that approval, the prolonged dispute between the OKH and the former Wehrmachtamt was resolved in favor of the new body. An additional decree, issued in May of the same year, clearly defined the OKW's tasks. The text established its role in preparing the country for a future conflict, administrative supervision, and direct coordination with each branch. Although the three services retained their specific high commands, the new scheme ensured that general direction resided in an office absolutely subordinated to Hitler. The previous structure, based on the Heer's relative autonomy, had been replaced by a system in which political command directly controlled all levels. Between 1935 and 1938, the transformation was so deep that military leadership shifted from a model supported by old professional authority to one where political leadership occupied the central place. The OKW became the tool that made this control possible and ensured that strategic decisions reached the services without independent mediation. Although each branch kept its internal hierarchy, ultimate direction was concentrated in the head of state, who used the new office to reinforce his authority over the armed forces. That reorganization marked the end of a period in which the services retained their own decision-making spaces and opened a phase in which centralization defined the functioning of the whole. Göring's Forbidden Skies, the hidden creation of the Luftwaffe. As the 1920s advanced and the limitations imposed on the country continued to block any visible aerial development, the idea of establishing a covert air force that left no direct traces began to circulate within restricted military circles. Internal studies from those years showed that aviation had acquired decisive weight in the recent war, and for several influential figures, it became evident that the country could not continue depending solely on a military structure based on infantry and artillery. Civil aviation, legally protected, offered an ideal front to establish equipment, schools, and technical cadres without drawing international attention. The documents analyzed in Germany and the Second World War explain how, from the mid-decade onward, a parallel training system was promoted in which pilots, navigators, and mechanics were prepared under civilian labels. The basis of this strategy was to camouflage military training within activities that appeared commercial, using aeroclubs, internal flight lines, and civilian manufacturers as a facade to create reserves of trained personnel. All of this required continuous coordination between army commanders and aeronautical company officials who received instructions about models, capabilities, and payloads that had to be discreetly integrated into their designs. Beginning in 1925, systematic contacts were established with the Soviet Union, where remote facilities made it possible to conduct tests that were prohibited within the country itself. These agreements were based on a very specific exchange, access to testing grounds in return for technical transfer that also benefited the Soviet side. This period made it possible to examine engines, experimental fuselages, and advanced procedures without formally violating the diplomatic framework in force. The tests were not massive, but they played a decisive role by generating knowledge that would later become essential. The data obtained in these facilities were turned into technical reports sent to offices responsible for planning a future air force. These reports included calculations of fuel consumption, performance at medium altitudes, structural resistance, and approach tactics. Each element was evaluated with the aim of integrating it into an air force that did not yet exist publicly, but needed precise parameters to become viable. In this environment of covert preparation, Hermann Göring began to occupy an increasingly decisive place. Although known for his earlier career, his rise in these matters became consolidated when he obtained direct responsibility for air-related issues within the new political environment of the early 1930s. Irving's biography notes that Göring saw aviation as a tool that combined prestige, power, and strategic capability, and from the beginning he promoted an expansion that had to remain hidden until the internal context allowed it to be revealed openly. For him, building an air force required controlling not only pilots but also factories, fuel, materials, airfields, and design centers. Studies from the MGFA show that between 1933 and 1935, the aeronautical industrial structure underwent accelerated transformation. Companies that had survived on civil contracts received discrete assignments supervised by military officials who reviewed models, tested prototypes, and adjusted specifications according to data from tests carried out in Soviet territory. Irving describes how Göring devoted direct time to meeting the heads of these industries, seeking to secure their loyalty and accelerate the delivery of aircraft that still had to remain in absolute secrecy. This period also marked a notable increase in pilot training. MGFA texts explain that under civilian titles, schools were opened where annual flight hours grew steadily. Instructors, carefully selected, took detailed notes on maneuvers, turning times, engine response, and squadron formations that operated as sports groups. Each exercise had a military dimension, even though it was presented as a civil routine. One of the most relevant elements of these years was the creation of logistical depots adapted to support an air force that could not yet officially exist. Spare parts, engines, tools, and fuel were gathered in distributed warehouses so as not to draw attention. MGFA documents show that planning followed a phased scheme, anticipating the moment when the secret aviation force could become visible, with the capacity to deploy quickly. Meanwhile, technical research advanced at a steady pace. Engineers worked on wing configurations, fuselage reinforcements, and cooling systems, often inspired by data obtained through cooperation with Soviet facilities. Faustian Bargin notes that the Soviet Union also used this exchange for its own modernization. But for German technicians, it served mainly as a laboratory without restrictions. Goering's biography highlights that as his political position became consolidated, he obtained the authority needed to personally direct aerial expansion, imposing decisions on procurement, airfield construction, resource allocation, and leadership selection. For him, aviation had to become an instrument capable of operating in any scenario, which led him to push for accelerating aircraft production, expanding schools and doubling the number of qualified technicians. Between 1934 and 1935, MGFA volumes confirmed that structures intended to formalize what had been built silently for years multiplied. The administrative evolution of this period shows that the project born in secrecy was now ready to present itself as a modern air force. Companies, instructors, engineers, pilots, and commanders formed an almost complete network that could be transformed into a national organization without starting from scratch. The direct violation of the restrictions imposed in 1919 was documented in detail in various historical studies. Each stage, from prototypes, schools, foreign agreements, and covert purchases to industrial expansion, broke the legal framework in force. However, these violations were not improvised. They were carried out through sustained planning that had begun a decade earlier and found in Goering its main driving force in the final stretch of the process. Specialized studies highlight that the public presentation of this air force would not have been possible without the knowledge accumulated since 1925. Training manuals, flight practices, aeronautical engineering and logistics were already established before the existence of the military aviation branch was openly acknowledged. For this reason, when the country displayed its new air arm, it did not emerge from nothing but from a full decade of silent testing and work. All these actions, which included covert training, foreign agreements, industrial development, the strengthening of civil aviation as a cover, and centralization under Goering, form the axis of the chapter recorded by the sources. Throughout these 10 years, the material, technical, and organizational base was formed that transformed an invisible structure into a modern air force. MGFA research and Irving's descriptions agree that this process not only challenged international restrictions, but made it possible that, when the time came to announce its existence, military aviation already had experienced personnel, prepared factories and commanders who had worked together for years. Thus closed a cycle begun in secret in the mid-1920s, sustained through discreet agreements, camouflage training, and an industry that had learned to produce under formal limitations. By 1935, the structure was ready to operate without disguise, and Goering had become the political and administrative center of that construction. That period, reconstructed from official sources and specialized research, reveals how a modern air force was created while it was still illegal to acknowledge its existence. The Reich's hidden engine, doctrine, factories, and war in motion. At the end of the 1920s, a silent process of reviewing methods and objectives emerged within the German military environment, driven by commanders seeking to take advantage of lessons from the previous war. From 1927 onward, analyses began circulating that examined failures and successes of the recent conflict in order to extract practical conclusions. These studies were not openly distributed, but within planning groups they became a frequent reference to update daily instruction. They insisted that any modern force would need to act quickly, keep commanders well informed, and coordinate units capable of moving with flexibility so that the initiative at each level aligned with higher intent. This approach expanded as younger officers discussed exercises and simulations designed to recreate changing environments where adaptability became a decisive factor. In those same years, conversations continued with Soviet technicians who participated in joint projects. The cooperation allowed work in discrete spaces where both countries experimented with procedures that would later influence their mode of operation. The shared facilities were used to test equipment, adjust systems, and study how to integrate new weapons into increasingly dynamic maneuvers. These contacts were kept discreet, although they broadened the perspective of German officers, who took note of what they learned in order to incorporate it into their own regulations. At the beginning of the 1930s, tests increased that were intended to evaluate the performance of small units under demanding conditions. Training officials insisted that these practices not be limited to manual-based exercises, so the scenarios forced reactions without detailed instructions, using available information on the ground. Each result was examined carefully, recording movements, response times, and command decisions. These data formed the basis of reports that, without being presented as closed doctrine, guided the evolution of military thought toward concepts centered on speed, coordination, and exploitation of opportunities. At the same time, the German economy entered a phase in which certain industrial sectors began receiving assignments that on paper were described as civil projects, but in practice responded to a different objective. Companies such as Krupp worked on models with dual utility, adapting processes and materials that could immediately be used if a larger state order arrived. Messerschmitt advanced in aeronautical designs that provided innovative technical solutions, while Daimler-Benz refined engines offering sufficient power for future applications that could not yet be specified publicly. These activities were structured through contracts that seemed ordinary, but included clauses capable of turning into larger programs without delays, allowing industry to be ready to respond when politics set a new direction. From 1933 onward, these industrial sectors increased their pace. Internal reorganization allowed departments that once acted separately to begin coordinating supplies, manufacturing processes, and delivery times, reducing costs and avoiding duplication. The ministries involved reviewed lists, corrected specifications, and sent directives centered on precise goals that linked bottlenecks with targeted investments. By late 1934, many key plants had increased their capacity, creating a framework capable of supporting expansions without altering each company's administrative facade. The expansion followed a planned pattern aligned with the state strategy of preparing a highly specialized productive apparatus. In parallel, the information sphere worked to present the public with a renewed image of the German soldier. The aim was for the population to associate the army with discipline, efficiency, and a sense of responsibility, reinforcing the idea that the new armed force represented a central element for national cohesion. To this end, communication officials carefully reviewed which photographs were published, which stories appeared in the press, and how military exercises were portrayed. Scenes were selected that showed order in the ranks, precision in maneuvers, and a polished aesthetic that conveyed confidence. Approved material was disseminated through newspapers, newsreels, and specialized magazines, ensuring that the public received a coherent message about the quality of the army and its role in national life. This narrative construction shaped perceptions without needing explicit rhetorical elaboration. Meanwhile, in the barracks, training was perfected in which different arms operated jointly. The experience accumulated in previous years allowed rapid movements to be combined with precise fire support, taking advantage of more efficient communications. Instructors insisted that each unit understand its function within the overall operation, since coordination had become a priority for achieving local superiority at the decisive moment. The aim was to exploit gaps, take advantage of breaches, and force the adversary to react under unfavorable conditions. These ideas were not yet presented as a closed system, but they formed the foundation that would later be associated with the German way of waging war. The economic structure continued to strengthen between 1935 and 1937, with investments aimed at expanding assembly lines, producing essential components in increasingly shorter periods. Companies coordinated deliveries to minimize downtime and guarantee that materials arrived when needed. This industrial network relied on state incentives that reduced financial risks and allowed experimentation with new processes without compromising company stability. Thus, an ecosystem was consolidated that could sustain accelerated growth if a larger expansion was required. In those same years, training methods were refined, multiplying exercises in which infantry, artillery, and mobile units operated in sequence. Constant practice allowed commanders to verify how troops responded to unforeseen events, adjusting orders so that individual initiative remained compatible with the general plan. Reports generated after each maneuver were sent to offices where results were compared, identifying useful patterns for designing future instructions. This sequence of testing, evaluation, and modification produced a body of knowledge that spread among the Army's levels without rigid doctrinal texts, since each officer learned to interpret situations practically. By 1938, the industrial machinery was ready to sustain prolonged efforts, and the political apparatus decided to employ it in specific scenarios. The armed forces had to demonstrate that they could move quickly, occupy key positions, and carry out coordinated operations in territories linked to state interests. In Austria, the military presence advanced without significant resistance, showing that command lines functioned with precision on the ground. Later in the Czech territory, the troops received orders to occupy previously studied points, conducting movements that combined marches, the concentration of units and deployment in strategic areas. These actions served as practical tests of the capability acquired during the previous decade. In 1939, the opportunity arose to put into operation the entirety of the military and economic apparatus built during the preceding years. The intervention in Poland showed how principles of mobility, coordination, and high tempo could be applied in a real theater of operations. Units crossed borders with defined tasks, linking advance maneuvers with support from different arms. The speed of execution prevented the adversary from reorganizing coherent defensive lines, and within a few days it became clear that the combination of training, reinforced industry, and centralized planning gave the Wehrmacht a power that had seemed unreachable not long before. Thus, 1939 closed a stage of more than a decade in which ideas, structures, and resources aligned to produce a military instrument capable of intervening in different scenarios with an effectiveness unseen in Europe since the previous Great War. The tests in Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Poland became the clearest evidence that the process initiated in the 1920s had transformed the German army into a force that no longer needed to disguise its reach. Germany entered the threshold of a larger conflict with doctrinal, industrial, and operational machinery ready to set the pace of the continent.